since the association was something that just sort of emerged, from the group elected 30 people, of which I was one of the 30, to get the association off the ground. That's all they said. We hardly knew what our mandate was, except to get it off the ground.
There were 30 people that were part of that leadership group, and it was a cross-section of sisters from different traditions. And those 30 set up times to meet. I think they probably were to meet 3 times over the course of the next year or two in different places in the country, where they could brainstorm about how to implement and how to live out what had begun at Woodstock. And these were women of extraordinary talent and extraordinary creativity.
After a short time, we had the meeting at Monroe, Michigan, which was the first meeting of the 30 with what came to be called the Coordinating Committee. And we met at the mother house of the IHM Sisters of Monroe, Michigan, whose president was Margaret Brennan. And she had been starting at that time the House of Prayer movement in the United States. And she invited us, and she had also been at Woodstock, and she invited us to come to Monroe, Michigan, and supported the whole thing. Financially supported our being there, food, anything we needed, and supported this start.
And at that time, they decided the thing to do would be to have a coordinating committee, small group, live together to set up communication and to concentrate on certain areas, the areas of work in monasteries, the areas of education and formation. Mm-hmm. And what were liturgy? Was that one of them?
Yes. Yes.
So we had all these different task groups. So we established a newsletter. We established what was called the working papers. And formation. I think the thing that was the highest priority was formation. And so...
Yes, formation, yes. And future programs, educational programs that the association could and should really tackle. No one else could do it. We had to do it ourselves somehow. So there were, what, 5 of us?
6. There were 6.
At that point, when the original coordinating committee no longer had a role, once we had set up, so the group that became a coordinating committee thereafter was more people that were available to do it. You know, there was not because this one is better to do it than that one at all. It was a question, a lot of these women were already superiors of their communities and were not really free to give time to it. And it just resolved itself down to Gertrude and myself. I had just gone out of office. John,
Sister Rose Page,
Claudette.
She was a Carmelite. Those 2 were Carmelites.
Mary Gehring, who was a Carmelite from Barrington, Rhode Island, and Karen. We all lived at the Esopus Monastery because this was a large monastery with not that many sisters, and they had room for us.
You know, we had a separate wing that we could take over, one floor.
And we had a meeting room in our own rooms, and then we met, and we also participated in their liturgy. And
yeah, we prayed and ate with them. It wasn't a separate community, but we could work together.
We did our own thing, which was mostly correspondence. We were concerned about funds also, and corporation. Were we working on corporation?
We had to
at that
become
time?
incorporated, yes.
Yeah.
We had to become incorporated. We set up a newsletter.
And we really, as a group of 30 agreed, it seemed as if you'd do better, you'd get it done, if this was a group that it could focus on doing it. And the whole business of, if we're going to set up programs, what programs, you know, and how do you, are you concerned more about your junior sisters or, and then, you know, the decisions and following through on decisions, where is it going to be, and so we were busy enough.
We felt that, first of all, we have to find out, like, what are the needs of the sisters? What kind of an association, you know, do we want? So we realized that formation was something that was very important, for the nuns. So that first year we organized 3 seminars. One was a prayer liturgy seminar, one was for sisters in initial formation, and one was for formation directresses. And we also started what we called the working papers, was ways to help nuns take initiative for earning their living, because many of the monasteries needed financial help.
What ACS started out was to help all of us in our communities to renew and update. So they sponsored a liturgy seminar, they sponsored a leadership training seminar, they sponsored formation seminars. And as a result of those seminars and those meetings and workshops, a lot of the sisters were trained and educated and updated in a way that they never would have been, perhaps.
Miriam Dardenne was putting together a program, an idea she had. It was a summer program, an extensive summer program that would be for contemplatives, that would be 6 weeks long. And she wanted the blessing, so to speak, of the organization to do it, to support it. She would, not financially, but under the aegis of the Association of Contemplative Sisters. And so she developed that program, again, with a coordinating committee.
Our committee, yeah.
Both Ruth and I served on that committee.
Miriam Dardenne always had this dream, and she was a prophetess in ACS in those days, that it ought to be possible for contemplatives to live on a college or educational campus and get courses and still live a contemplative lifestyle. So she got backing and resource people for a 4-year pilot project. So it was 4 years.
That program was accredited. They could, the sisters who attended that program for 6 weeks in the summertime could get college credit. The first year it was related to Woodstock, the Jesuit college. The next 2 years it was related to Marquette University. And it was worked out in such a way, and Miriam was the director of the program, it was worked out in such a way that we could put together a contemplative study program, and we could have it in our own situation. So it was close to Marquette, it was close to Woodstock, but and we could choose our own professors, as long as they were professors who were accredited to do the work.
It just created a very contemplative atmosphere, so that it wasn't that much of a change from our own life. We had time for prayer, and many times we eat lunch in silence, because the lectures would have been so intense that it's like you didn't even want to talk.
Each 2-week program, each 2 weeks was like a whole semester if we had been in a class. So you can imagine how our minds were being stretched, because we were taking in all these new ideas and experiences, and we had 2-week segments, so that's 2, 4, 6. So by the time, I was so grateful to have retreat, because I don't know if I could have gone back into just community.
All told, 7 sisters from our community went, and like Mary said, 1 sister went all 4 years, but it's like they whet our appetites to go. They really spoke it up, and we could see, changes in their own lives. In fact, 1 sister ended up leaving because she got in touch with who she really was. But I could hardly wait to go. Again, I was a postulant, and some of our older sisters thought, well, if I'd go, I'd probably leave too. But I didn't.
Yes, I went to the last 1974, the last summer program. It also was 6 weeks, and it was a big decision for me, because in my community there was not the awareness or openness to some of the things that were happening. But I just felt I had to make that decision on my own and break through this, whatever it was in me that was fearful. And so I went, and Miriam Dardenne would really, she was like a connecting point all through the 6 weeks, because we had 2 weeks of, in the year I went, 2 weeks of Robert North in scripture. He's a scripture scholar, and the subject was prophets for the 21st century. And then after the 2 weeks, we went to Marquette University. That was also on the campus. But in between these things, she always made sure that we connected it, because it just made it as a whole that way. And she was like the teacher of it, keeping the class together.
We knew from our sisters that had gone the year before that they had 3 Jungian analysts from California women who worked with dreams and worked with clay and a lot of art forms. And so I remember saying to myself, I know clay is the most revealing of your unconscious, so I'm going to stay away from the clay. And so when I got there, I headed for the crayons and started back in kindergarten because we had to do a lot of drawing and expressing of emotions and stories in some kind of an art form. And they said, imagine there's a big empty pot in the middle of the floor, and you were all around. Every night we would share whatever we were working on that day. If we were working on art or poetry or whatever, and whatever we were asked to think about and pray over. And that night we were supposed to share. Nobody was allowed to respond to the sharing, neither for or against. But what this created was a wonderful environment of total acceptance and non-judgmentalness. And I believe that's why so many people grew, I feel. I grew because nobody's condemning or judging what I'm saying. And it was the most profound experience I've ever had in my life.
We were told to go down to this room and choose, not choose, just pick a color, pick whatever you wanted to work with. Don't think about it. Well, I said, I don't do things without thinking about it. So out of your unconscious, you sit there and try not to think, and you grab a color. It was amazing what came up. And to draw your wound, well, that was really interesting. You know, what my wound became something that was reversible, or you know, the two sides of one whole.
And we had a Trappist monk with us. And every morning we had this prayer form of putting on music and moving to music. Well, the first time, you know, he'd never done this, and he moved about a ½ inch each way. But at the end of the 6 weeks, he was flying all over the place.
Knocked over the lamp.
And another symbol of the 6 weeks is, one of the women said, now when I first came here, I worked with clay, and I closed my eyes, and when I opened it, I saw that I had formed a snake, and I wanted to drop it, break it, and start over. But she said, I realized that that is part of me, and I want you to know I have come to love my snake.
Another part of me that I had never been in touch with was my dreams. They had us pay attention to our dreams and trust their message to us, you know, what they could speak to us. So that was my beginning, I think, of journaling with my dreams.
It was just unbelievable what happened to all of us. I know the insights and the awareness and the growth, and it was just a wonderful experience.
It was a 6-week program. It was an integral program of community life, community prayer, study, and listening, you know, in class. And that was a great, great creative project. We did really wonderful things in those years. One of the really creative things that ACS did was the way it put together its organization. We met, Ruth and Gert and I met Dave Ruhmkorff, whom I'm sure they also have commented on, and he had evolved a contemplative way of putting together organizations. And when we met him through the Medical Mission Sisters in Philadelphia. And he got very excited about working with a contemplative group because he felt his process was contemplative. And so we began working with him to put together the organization. So we didn't just say, we'll have a president, we'll have a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer, and board of directors, or the way organizations are always put together. We began to live the organization, and then we slowly, through a contemplative process, formed how it would be organized. And in this process, which was also partially a training of us as leaders, which we extended extensively later in seminars, we put together a leadership that had a president and a chairperson of the Delegate Assembly. The chairperson of the Delegate Assembly operated through the entire year, as did the president, because we met annually at that time. The chairperson worked in relation to the delegates. So she did all the work in relation to the delegates. She led all the decision-making of the delegate assembly. So you wouldn't have had a process person running that. She ran. You might have had a process person here, but she ran the decision-making, and she knew how to do it, and she was equipped to do it. It was a very careful, simple, but sophisticated process in which we were well trained. But what happened was, you had these two people who could work together and who could support one another. For instance, Jean Alice was president and I was chairperson, and Cecilia was my secretary. It was a wonderful working situation. I didn't attend one meeting back when I was still coming to all the meetings. And they made that change, and I was really sad. I was really sad because I think we had something very wise going. Now what was happening as time goes on, you have trouble getting leadership. And so to get two people who, it was almost like two presidents really, in a certain way, wasn't always easy. And people began saying, oh, can't we have a more simple organization? And in a way it doesn't matter. But it was a wise organization, nevertheless, and I'm sure now it's just as wise.
The basic structure was a delegate assembly, and then the president and her consultants, one of who was probably secretary and treasurer.
So at the point where we implemented that, which was the fall of '72, was when I really bowed out of my office as chairman of, in the rather loose fashion as we understood it, and that Vilma Silos was elected president.
When we had our first national meeting, among other things, we had our elections, and I don't know how it happened, but I was elected the first president. And so, and Jean Alice was the president of the chairperson of the delegate assembly.
And I stayed on. I then became one of her assistants.
Yes.
And was her gopher. I served as Ruth's gopher, and I was Vilma's gopher. And I think Jean Alice was the first chairman of the delegate assembly. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's
and eventually
right.
Jean Alice became president too.
As president of ACS, I was able to attend like the Canon Law Society meeting and the Vickers Ridge. I felt like I entered a solitary life, and I traveled a lot after that. It's been very exciting for me.
That was how the original structure of ACS, I mean, after the very loose coordinating committee, but this is what enabled it to carry on. And for the first several years, there were annual meetings.
And it was still, it was still religious women out of communities, and that their concerns were the community life.
Then we decided that we should begin training leaders in our communities. And so we planned a leadership training program that would go over a period of year and a half, I don't remember, in which there would be 3 sessions, 6 months or so apart. And we would take 40 people from communities. They signed up, sent people from any of the contemplative communities. And Dave Ruhmkorff and his staff trained us. And as we were trained, we were sent 2 by 2 into the communities to train them about goal setting and new visions and how you work with all the things in community. In most cases, one of the staff people would go with each 2 nuns. So in a sense, they weren't left entirely on their own. But it was like in-service training for them by going to the communities who then participated in that way. And I remember Ruth and I went together, and we went to Barre, Vermont, the Carmelite Monastery. And we were one of the only, there were just a couple of groups that they sent out without any staff person. We were on our own. but most went with them. And so that was a wonderful thing in which my community still uses the process.
One of the things that that became obvious as ACS continued to grow was that people were members of ACS that came from the whole United States and into Canada. And it wasn't always possible for sisters to attend a General Assembly because of the distances and the expense involved in that. So what emerged was the need to have geographic regions where the sisters, if they couldn't travel to the General Assembly, could at least meet in a regional setting. And so these regions were set up.
And in the meantime, that first year, we were doing things like trying to do PR work with bishops, trying to explain ourselves, that somehow it wasn't that we were just there praying for people, that we wanted to somehow be reflectors of the contemplative dimension that's inherent in the human. Everybody has to be in on this, if the church is to be a contemplative church.
Then we went to St. Louis to meet with Cardinal Carberry. And we met with him with his secretary, Monsignor Granich. And though Cardinal Carberry seemed to make an effort to understand and was kind enough, we apparently didn't make very much progress. And his secretary, Monsignor Granich, was extremely difficult in the meeting, extremely difficult. We had numerous meetings with people like Carberry, later on, some years later, with Abbot Meyer, Archbishop Meyer, who was at that time head of the Congregation for Religious. Very difficult meetings in which we were treated with enormous condescension. And so believe me, ACS came into existence at a great price.
It was certainly a time of transition, and having had the windows opened really wide and letting the fresh air in, you realized that things had to change. And so what was going on at the same time was that sisters were understanding their personal lives and the community life that they lived, and the life of the community, the life of the broader church, and that all these things were in a state of transformation and a state of evolution. And so this was not like a segmented thing that was going on. There was, these things were going on at all different levels, as I say, personal, community, and much broader based than that. And so it was a time of newness. It was also a time, obviously, of making choices that on reflection might not be the best choices, but for creativity to flourish, there has to be chaos, and hopefully things emerge from the chaos that are worthwhile, and that's what happened.
I had hoped, and I think we all had hoped, Ruth and Gert and all of us, Betty, Pat, all the people who were there, the 30, we had hoped and we worked hard for some time for ACS to be an organ of communication with the bishops, among contemplatives, and with Rome. We needed to be able to express our own voice about our own life, and we didn't have any way to do this. So there were many of us from contemplative communities who were in the beginning of ACS who wanted this to come about. Because of the conflict among the communities, those who wanted renewal, those who didn't want renewal, the letters going to Rome, we never could really get approval from Rome, and possibly never would have done it. If I have any disappointment about ACS. It's that we were never able to achieve that, and that it turned into something quite different from what I and others had hoped that we would be able to do. And we don't have that, and we never did achieve that. Certainly not because of ACS so much, as just because of all the conflict in contemplative life in the American church, and in the world really, but certainly in the American church.
One of the things that we did that was creative was not have the membership and the delegates be, say, like the prioress and an elected delegate, but it was open to the whole communities. Communities became members as individuals rather than, as communities, so that it was like an official representation. And that was a creative thing to do because it got more community members able to attend meetings rather than the same people going all the time.
Since the membership was individual, there was more freedom for people to join. And what happened was that ACS then was able to form its own governing body from the membership. It was not dealing with superiors only or with delegates of the entire community. It was, each sister was, so to speak, equal with the other.
The exception to the individual membership was the membership of the Metropolitan Association of Contemplative Communities, known as MAC.
Contemplatives in the New York City area had already organized before they joined ACS, and they called themselves the MAC region, Metropolitan Association of Contemplatives. So MAC was about 75 people from the New York area that joined en masse to ACS. So they were a very important part of the organization.
Membership gradually changed as more sisters left their religious orders to follow their baptismal commitment in the lay state. They were no longer considered active members and became associate members. As an associate member, one could not vote or be part of the leadership of ACS.
I had mentioned previously that it was also a time of transition in people's personal lives. And what this often meant was that you had sisters who began a process of discernment of vocation, which meant that for a period of time they may have been outside the monastery, trying to discern whether or not they should return. They would be out on exclaustration, or there would be leaves of absence. Because of the different rules in the different communities, this took lots of different forms, and the amount of time a sister could be on leave of absence was particular to the community to which she belonged. So during this time of women discerning their vocation, they had begun as members of ACS, and so they continued as members of ACS. They would continue to come to the meeting, and maybe if at the last meeting they had come with a habit on, they might come this time without a habit because they were in a time of discernment and were on leave of absence.
Cecilia Wilms was one such person who was going through the process of discerning her vocation and who eventually left Redwoods Monastery. ACS became her lifeline. It was an association in its initial development stage, and Cecilia entered into that development first as a beneficiary and more as a vital contributor and worker. Cecilia was always very aware of and deeply grateful for the wealth of spiritual benefits ACS offered and the community it provided. As she settled into life as a hermit in Spokane, Washington, she formed deep bonds in the local community. She became a spiritual resource for many women and men, and it seemed natural to introduce them to her community of ACS. Regions functioned with varying degrees of flexibility regarding membership, particularly the Western region. Choice of full or associate membership was left up to the individual, and many of those in Spokane chose full membership.
So in different regions, what happened was people were introduced to ACS because it was a way of enhancing their prayer life. This happened very particularly in the Western region. And this was seen as certainly, it was seen as being in total harmony with the objectives of ACS. And as years went on, it was lived out. And so the experience in the region was a real experience, and it was integral. It was integral to everything that ACS was, supposed to be, so to speak. However, this was not the experience in every region. So when it came time for general assemblies, what might have been very much taken for granted and have been just the way things were in a region like the West might have been kind of a great shock to people from another region, where the idea of having non-religious in the group was seen as, well, this isn't according to what ACS was founded for. It was founded for contemplative communities, which in fact it was. And so the more people that are involved in any organization and the looser the structure is, the more freedom, the more creativity is allowed and is actually is encouraged. The more chance there was for there to be some misunderstanding and for there to be some actual hard feelings that emerged at different times as different regions became aware of people having a perspective that they didn't share and felt that was being untrue to the beginnings of ACS.
I started out from Berry Carmel as a full member, but then when I left Berry Carmel and went back to the Grey Nuns, I became an associate member. That was when they had the two different kind of memberships, and I met Celia Willems, who was just a wonderful person, and she was also an associate member, and neither one of us liked that category. We struggled with this association or associative members and full members for quite a while until it came to a head, and it was decided to decide at the 1986 ACS meeting, which was the Dalton, Pennsylvania meeting.
The General Assembly of ACS that in 1986 dealt with the issue of membership was really begun by the election the year 1984 at the assembly in New York.
Mount St. Vincent.
Mount St. Vincent's. It was a very excited meeting in which the issue of membership, which had been really not dealt with but lived with for years and years since the time of all of the canonical orders, meeting the Vatican II issues, and a lot of members leaving their respective contemplative groups and yet maintaining the membership in ACS, which they had enjoyed as a member. So there were a lot of women who had been religious, who were no longer religious, canonical religious, who were members of ACS. And that was an issue that was needed to be dealt with and was not dealt with until it came to a head in 1984. And at that time, it was very difficult, really, to make the change that would not have a traditional, or not traditional, but one of the presidents who had so well led the organization up to that point. They were looking for a president who would handle this issue, and no one wanted to handle that because of the changes that it would effect. So that election was rather amazing. Instead of someone who had long association with the ACS, there was elected someone who had always been a member, but not in leadership or even in delegate work or in any of that. That was someone from the Midwest, unheard of, Joe Casey.
Ourselves.
It was the feeling of a whole line of people there to be elected, and they all stepped back except Joe, who did go home with that. And that issue was the main focus. So I had 2 years to prepare a meeting that would deal with that issue.
Celia and I both were at that meeting, and Sister Mary of the Blessed Sacrament was there from MAC. She was a delegate from MAC, and she was the one that was stating their position that they wanted it to continue to be separate because they wanted to have this voice for all the contemplative sisters. One of the things that meant a lot to me at the Dalton meeting, it was my first experience of women who owned the liturgy themselves. And at the opening liturgy, the bishop came out to welcome us and to celebrate Eucharist. And I think it was Celia Wilms. I'm not sure who got the courage to do it, but she went up and asked if he would consecrate enough hosts for the whole week. And he was taken back a little by the request, but he did it. And because it was the bishop who did it, nobody else questioned it at the seminary. So the seminary had been trying to make sure that the good sisters had a priest every day, and then so we said we didn't need one. And they gave us this very nice room, and we had the chairs like in a big oval around the room with everyone facing in, and the table in the center. And every day we had our own liturgies, which included receiving the Eucharist. But the priests were not involved in it, and they were the most beautiful liturgies. They just called me alive. And I can still see. In particular, one night, Celia Wilms was leading the Kiss of Peace, and we were all seated. And she danced around the room and took someone and had them stand up and then begin to dance around the room and take someone else. And so just gently, one at a time, from different places, we stood up and started to dance and hug one another. And I don't know, it was such a different feeling and such different liturgy that to me stands out. And I think it helped us an awful lot with the dialogue to have had these very nourishing feminine liturgies for the first time for most people.
Plus being in small groups consistently, the same small group, to go over the questions of where is ACS going? What is it now? What is it that we need to do?
Lilla Hull, who gave one talk, and she's from Maryknoll Cloister in New York, now in Guatemala, but her talk centered around membership and the possibility of the associate members becoming either oblates or associates of the ACS. And that, well, it was presented, but then it had to be discussed and brought up later. And then Ginny and Shirley gave a talk about their living in experimental community and their struggle with the hierarchy to get the approval of this contemplative expression of the precious blood sisters. And I think the 10 of them, there were 10 of them to begin with, and when they finally got the thing from Rome that says, okay, you can go ahead, well, the foundress had died, and quite a few of them had left, so they went on their own, and were living in a small community. But it was their experience with the church and the different things that went on. And then the other talk was by Rosalie Bertel. Yeah.
An articulation of a prophetic role as a contemplative, which I've stuck with since then, and I think is my charism or my call. And I wanted very much to be a full member of ACS. It was very important to me because I had found that in the canonical contemplative life, I couldn't express this charism, and I didn't know what to do with it. I needed the support of other women. I needed to belong in a community because I knew I couldn't do it myself. And I did enter the Grey Nuns, and I must say they've always loved me and supported me, but they also don't know what I'm doing, and they mostly leave me alone. And they're supportive, but not in the same way that ACS had the potential to be supportive. So for me, it was like a gut level life issue. And so I think Celia felt the same way, and I know so many others did, but I think we articulated it at the meeting. We said what this meant to us, and we said how we couldn't see that there was a difference in the call, whether or not you were within a canonical framework.
The reading that was chosen that morning was about King Solomon to decide which woman would be the mother of this baby. They were both claiming this baby as their own, and he said, you know, shall I cut it down the middle? And the real mother came forth, you know, to claim.
I think as I recall, we were in 2 rows around the room. The inner circle were the delegates, and then outside were people who had come who were not delegates. But people just very simply and quietly said where they stood on the issue, and there was quite a variety of opinions as we went around. I think most of these fears were enunciated by somebody, you know, of what could happen if we made this change. And Mary Devereaux was very quiet, but at the end she went up and stood in the middle of the room and said that she really wanted to say something, not on behalf of MAC, she was their delegate, but from her heart. And that was when she talked about Solomon and the baby. And she said the rightful mother is the one that doesn't want to split the organization. And at that point, everybody just fell apart. And you know, I think Celia went up and hugged Mary Devereaux. Joan hugged me, and everybody started hugging everybody else. The meeting was over. There was we did nothing after that, and we never voted on it. It just happened. I mean, that was it. There was no sense of discussing it after that. You couldn't have.
Because of the decision to allow laywomen to join ACS as full members, MAC withdrew their membership.
I don't think we should minimize the impact of losing MAC as a whole, because it was a very large part of ACS, part of the history of ACS, and it meant too that other communities as communities didn't belong anymore. And so then it was up to individuals within the communities to take the initiative to belong to ACS and become involved. And so there was a fear also that this would be the end of ACS. And another thing that many of us feared that had left the canonical contemplative communities was that the canonical contemplatives wouldn't come anymore. I don't know if you knew that, but a lot of us were afraid that they would then withdraw and say, well, this is some other organization, it's not the one we started. And so that there was a great deal of fear around, and the air was electric, I think. And The resolution of it was so powerful that I don't think I'll ever forget it my whole life. It was so overwhelming and so right. It was so right. And the fear went out the window. you know? It was a powerful experience.
It was dealt with like, okay, this is a foregone conclusion that we are going to rewrite the mission statement and come up with something, because I think that questionnaire that we had done before showed that our spinning our wheels on this whole question of membership was the wrong place, and we had to, our mission statement was not clear enough for, so that's what we had to do, is sit down and write that, and we did. We did a lot of, what did you mention, finger paints and different things with art on the floor
art
to express some of the things inside of us. Where am I now? And after that, we began with the hard work of rewriting this. Each one was given a section or chose to take this section of it, that section, and they worked and reworked that.
I remember too, at the end of the meeting, there was such great joy, and that was also the first time I had seen the sisters dance up the aisle with the altar cloth. And they danced in, I don't know what the priest thought of this, but they brought all the things in, and the big altar cloth went up first, you know, and it was just dancing down the aisle, and then they put it out on the altar, and then the other people danced in and put the candles on or put the cross on.
I must say that in 1992, I had hints about the possibility of being selected as president at the Madison Assembly, so it didn't come as a big surprise. I did, however, feel very honored by the choice and recognize the importance of nurturing the creative energies between the lay and canonical groups. Many people saw me as being a bridge person between the lay and canonical contemplatives. This was because I had lived in both worlds and appreciated both. As I look back over those 4 years, I recognize what a privilege it was to serve ACS.
Transition for ACS, or a kind of, turning a corner for ACS in more recent years, is that some communities have opted out of ACS, and the membership has become to be very predominantly lay membership. And what I think the reason for this is probably fairly simple. The needs of the communities that were needs in 1969 are no longer the needs of 1997 and have not been the needs of communities for quite some time. Basically, the needs have been met, and ACS met those needs initially, and the community's needs are now needs that they have been educated to address on their own, and the need for education can be met by the different communities on its own and individual sisters. So in other words, the sisters that began ACS have seen a great maturation take place in the types individuals in these communities, the needs, and I would say that we were very needy following the Vatican Council. We are still needy in many ways, but we are able to meet those needs in different ways than was once seen. So the whole makeup of ACS has gone through a radical transformation.
As the change took place in the membership, we are the minority now, as you can see. We are the minority at these meetings. And I know some of the sisters says, well, it's no longer the way it used to be, and therefore we don't have to go anymore. But what the lay people said is, they look to the contemplative traditions for the spirituality that feeds their prayer life. And so if we just don't show up, well, it's true, they can get it through books. There's lots of books, but it's not the same. And I feel, at least in my community, the sisters that come to the meetings, they are so inspired by the laity and their intense prayer life and their seriousness about being faithful to that prayer when they have obligations and jobs and families that we do not have. And so it's like an impetus to us to be true to what we are, because we have so many helps that they don't have. And so we inspire each other, and we need each other. It's like it's like the church. We need everybody in the church.
I am just over and over and over and over impressed at the capacity that the organization has, or not the capacity maybe, but I guess the capacity the individual people have to contribute things that are of such high caliber. There are a great many members in ACS now that are so well educated in their fields, and so bring so much strength and so much diversity, and also so much thirst for the truly spiritual. But I just see this as a part of the evolution of ACS, that there is a radical difference in the ACS of the 1997 variety from the 1969 variety. And the constant in this time has been that the women who find nourishment from ACS and try to nurture others have their foothold in a life of prayer. And this seems to be the constant that runs through. But a lot of the other things have gone through a radical transformation.
I was very gratified by that to see how the membership had changed and expanded, and confirmed my initial understanding way back in the beginning of our struggle that our contemplative search is, and our contemplative lifestyle, if we want to give it that label, is not the prerogative of the few who have the luxury of setting themselves apart and living a specialized style of life, but it's a profoundly inherent human struggle. You know, we're all walking that path, and if some choose to live it more superficially without stopping to delve down, that doesn't change the fact that where their heart ticks and where their really inner spirit is centered, if you find your place there, you're on a contemplative search. That's whatever your lifestyle or whatever.
It's profoundly human.
It's profoundly human. It's not the specialty
of
ours. At all. It's deeply Christian. Well, it's more than just Christian. It's broader than just the Christian framework.
If there's anything that contemplatives, and I'm not talking about religious, but contemplative women, contemplative persons can do, it's to make that awareness stand out to other people.
Pass it on, make it available.
It's a call, it's a search and it's a call, and maybe some people can help others recognize that's their call also, and perhaps give them the courage to respond to it, because sometimes it takes courage.
Idea of what we would now call in our community contemplative presence was very powerful. That I heard it expressed theologically in a paper written by a Dutch Carmelite, and what he was saying was that contemplation is an openness to the whole of reality and to the God of history, and it has this, as Gert I think said, it has this opening out aspect to it, but then it has the going within aspect, this into your own soul with this presence to the whole of God. And he said the problem is that cloister has only expressed this inner part of the gift and the grace of contemplation, whereas it has to begin to express in its whole structure the openness to God. So that's what I think came out in its own language at Woodstock, and the need for ongoing education, the need for collaboration, the need to look at the whole aspect of work. And I think Woodstock was a Vatican II for contemplatives. I think ACS has been the place where those insights have been able to be carried and nurtured, and it's unfolding like a daylily. I mean, it's still unfolding for us.
This is just to draw our whole interview to a conclusion, and we can't think of any better way than to quote from the familiar T.S. Eliot, all right? We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time.
Amen.
Amen.